we're going to jump right into some best ball questions today. Obviously, Mike, a DFS legend, but bringing you in this time of the year, we get to talk some other fun topics here. And obviously after the best ball run last year, especially want to pick your brain. I'll see what we can add to our process as we all try and get back into that position. And one of the things that you had mentioned as we were kind of chatting about the show is this question of the early QBs. And we know that historically, when you take a QB too early, the win rates are very, very low. But yet we now have some QBs who can score so many points. And then especially perhaps if you're looking at tournament play, that's going to affect how you want to do it a little bit. If you think that a QB gives you 1 week upside that really stands out from the pack. But then this other question, I think, as we head into 2022, and we'll be talking about this sort of across the shows as we think about how we want to do the 2022 season. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that rounds 4 and 5 are not as stocked at other positions as they have been some years, that area gets flatter earlier. That also changes what you want to do at quarterback, right? Mm-hmm. Because the opportunity cost there is a big component of whether or not you go QB early. So kind of start us off with the big picture. What are you looking here at the QB position? Are you willing to go after some of these guys early?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I wanted to get your thoughts on it and kind of had pointed it out pre-show was when I was doing our Superflex best ball rankings and we were trying to figure out, the correct scarcity to apply to each position. After the top 15 or so quarterbacks, there's just a really significant drop off in upside. And it feels like in a more predictable fashion. I remember last year I looked at some data that TJ Hernandez of 4for4 had looked at. And one of the things he had evaluated, this was heading into the 2021 season, was not only did the top 12 quarterbacks that year, the previous year, separate a little bit more, but it was tied pretty closely to ADP. And I think we're seeing a shift in the NFL where, 5-10 years ago, maybe Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson had just a crazy efficient year, right? And it wasn't necessarily repeatable. This year, the best quarterbacks on the best offenses, they're either guys that can run and use their legs that gives them this edge. Like before, the worst quarterbacks, that was, somewhat of an equalizer. And you get guys like Tom Brady, who their pass rate over expectation is so high. I mean, teams are utilizing their strengths a bit more. So we're seeing teams go very pass heavy with at the quarterback position. So teams like Mahomes are able to separate a little bit more because the volume's there. It's not just an efficiency thing.
And Mike, as you look at that then, and we talk about best ball tactics, and it's interesting you mentioned that because we had JJ on the show and that was one of his big things too. It's not just that these guys are separating, but it's that you can pick out the ones who are going to separate. And that is a big difference from if they're all over the place. Yeah. When you're looking at it then, and we often talk about the QB window, for so long, late round quarterback was so effective in all formats that you would have drafters try and take a couple of quarterbacks late. That obviously burns an extra roster spot. But even then, the win rate in our roster construction explorers suggests that it doesn't work, right? So whether it's because you're not getting the right QBs or you're burning the roster spot or a combination of the two, that approach was really sort of a siren song that got people going off in the wrong direction. And in order to be successful, you needed to have this build that had at least 2 QBs in the window. Is that something that you would consider again? You talk about that top 15. And so we traditionally looked at it from the perspective of, what rounds are the sweet spot, but obviously the rounds are going to coincide to a very strong extent with who those actual quarterbacks are. If you're going to take 2, do you still want to have one of these top 5 guys? Is that going to kind of go draft by draft? How are you looking at having the right overall build at QB within the dynamics that you just discussed?
Yeah, I do think saving a roster spot's a really big deal. Just the attrition over the course of a season, having that extra skill player roster spot. One of the strategies I love to do most is really loading up on quantity of wide receivers. But even if you're doing a 0 running back strategy, to have an extra running back spot is really big deal. So I like to only take 2, which means I'm taking, I got to get one of the top 10 or so guys. Whether I need to get 2 is a bit draft by draft. I was glad to hear you mention you think rounds 4 and 5 this year are a little bit grosser than previous seasons, because I felt that way. And sometimes you never know at the beginning of an offseason if I'm just remembering wrong, because we're going to talk ourselves into certain guys over the course of the summer. Like, do I feel this way at the beginning of every season? But especially when we talk wide receiver in a little bit, I've got some thoughts there. But I do think that 4-5 range this year, last year for me, it was the end of round 6. Like, there were certain guys where if they didn't fall past mid 5, like T Higgins and some of these guys, like once they went, I was like, I'm going to go to a onesie position, a quarterback or a tight end. And this year, I do think rounds 4 and 5, it's okay. And what's interesting is our rankings, the base of our rankings at Established to Run are from projections with like baked in upside scenarios with players. So it's a really good base. It's not the ultimate best way of doing things because there's so much that you need to account for in terms of the chaos of an NFL season and the range of outcomes, but it gives you a good base. And what we found comparing our quarterback ranks to ADP was the mid-tier quarterbacks were a lot more overvalued by the market than the top quarterbacks. Like, the top quarterbacks actually kind of going a little bit more where we think they should go based on scarcity. So I found that really interesting. So I'm pretty into trying to grab an elite quarterback. I know it's somewhat early to talk specifics, but someone like Lamar Jackson seems like, he's going off at QB4 on FFPC. I think a lot of places have Allen, Herbert, Mahomes ahead of him. And I think he's got as good a shot as anyone to be the overall QB1. Kyler too, just to be able to get those guys in round 5, I think is a pretty big deal this year.
And you kind of mentioned the guy that I was excited to hear you talk about. We're going to have an article coming out, I think, later today on Lamar Jackson. And
why? I mean, it's just shocking to me where he's going right now. So
yeah, it's kind of crazy. We have a new writer going to make his debut, so everybody look for that. But Lamar Jackson. So then I guess the question you mentioned, kind of that second tier, maybe those guys aren't as well valued even as the top guys. And that again kind of goes to where you think the wide receiver value is. But when we're looking at somewhat of a top 6, then would it be correct based on what you just said? And again, it depends on your draft and whether or not Allen and Mahomes, if they do fall a little bit. But are you looking to take kind of whoever's in that 4, 5, 6 range if the top 6 really is kind of the top tier?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Allen goes just too early. The opportunity cost is too high on him. But yeah, kind of. I don't mind tier-based drafting. There's some other guys too that I mean, it kind of depends where the skill players fall, but I'm not going to get too tied to any single guy. Lamar's my favorite right now for sure. But, we're pretty high on Tom Brady, which seems weird, but like FFPC scoring where it's you get a little bit more in favor of the passing quarterbacks because the yardage is 1 point every 20 yards instead of 1 point every 25. I would throw him and Dak in that group too. It almost gives you, I think, 8 quarterbacks that I'm really pretty comfortable with. I think Burrow's going a little bit early. We have him actually 8th of that group, but his ADP is a little bit sooner.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.